Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Hal Draper's Marxist Theory of Revolution, Volume 1, The State and Bureaucracy. This chapter is titled State Autonomy in Precapitalist Society. The formula version of Marx's theory of the state, quote, Committee for Managing the Common Affairs, end quote, of the ruling class, is the formula for relative normality. Like most formulas that sum up experience, we have been testing the meaning of the theory by getting behind the formula, investigating the conditions under which the state tends to assert autonomy from the ruling classes to a greater or lesser extent. To push this inquiry further, let us leave the boundaries of Bonapartism, as Engels did in the passage which inaugurated this discussion at the beginning of chapter 16. Engels had broached the general category of exceptional periods, quote, in which the warring class balance, quote, in which the warring classes balance each other so nearly that the state power, as ostensible mediator, acquires for the moment a certain degree of independence of both, end quote. As we saw, under this head, he included three Bonapartists, Napoleon I, Louis Bonaparte, and Bismarck, but the first example he adduced was, as a matter of fact, not a Bonaparte at all. Quote, such was the absolute monarchy of the 17th and 18th centuries, which held the balance between the nobility and the class of burghers, end quote. The absolute monarchy, as a state form, reigned over a long historical era, not, quote, for the moment, but for a couple of centuries, more or less depending on the country. No Bonaparte figure was necessarily involved, the absolute monarchies being headed by individual monarchs of various shapes and sizes. Footnote. That Engels, like others, thought of Bonapartism as a form that tended to require a Bonaparte figure is attested by his remark that, quote, there is no empire without an emperor, no Bonapartism without a Bonaparte. The system is cut to the man's measure. It stands and falls with him, end quote. Engels. The context in 1888 was the question how long Bismarck would last. Give me 1 second here. Gotta get the footnotes. Okay, I think we got it. Okay. Letter from Engels to Babel, 12th of April, 1888. Okay. End footnote. We have here an ongoing political system involving an autonomized state of a particular kind for a whole historical period. In a number of disparate countries. The absolute monarchy is not introduced by Engels as an example of Bonapartism. On the contrary, it is subsumed along with the three Bonapartisms under a broader head, to which no, quote, ism or other label is applied, but which is described. They are all autonomized states resting on an equilibrium of contending class forces. To generalize a point made in the last chapter, they are all cases reflecting a system in dissolution, and hence a crisis of a certain magnitude. In the case of Louis Bonaparte, we said, it was a particular political system that was on its last legs, but not the society itself. In different terms, the same would apply to the other Bonapartisms, but in the period of absolute monarchy, the political system was the outcome of a social system in dissolution, feudal society. The crisis was on an entirely different order of magnitude, and the persistence of the autonomized state for a whole historical era was of the same order. New section. Section 1. The state that swallowed up society. As we know, Marx and Engels were quite aware of the possibility that the final crisis of a society might not be soluble even by revolution. They stated it in one of the most conspicuous places in all their writings, the opening statement in the Communist Manifesto, of the proposition that all history since primitive times is, quote, the history of class struggles, end quote. Quote, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, any word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. End quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. Engels repeated the alternatives much later in Anti-During, not about the past, but with reference to the future, quote, its, bracket, the bourgeoisie's, end bracket, own productive forces have grown beyond the bourgeoisie's control, and as if necessitated by a law of nature, are driving the whole of bourgeois society towards ruin or revolution, end quote. Engels, Anti-During. As the proletariat grows into a power, then, quote, under penalty of its own destruction, it is forced to accomplish this revolution, end quote, which abolishes capitalism. And that quote was from Anti-During. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels assumed everyone was aware of the great example in the past of the, quote, common ruin of the contending classes, end quote. It was the disintegration without revolution of the society of the Roman Empire, an example which weighed heavily on all political thought and on its terminology. Quote, Caesarism later became a general catchword for personal and military dictatorship, but in terms of Marx's conception, Caesar's dictatorship was undoubtedly one Roman analog of Bonapartism. Caesar was the last step in the downfall of the patrician democracy for the ruling class as a whole, organized in the Roman Republic. After a long period of class struggle stemming from the bid of the rich plebeians for more political power and the ongoing battle between debtors and creditors, Caesar's state maneuvered between the class pressures of the patricians and the rich plebs with an eye on its own interests. Footnote. One may be misled by the fact that, in his 1869 preface to a new edition of the 18th Brumaire, Marx expressed the hope of, quote, eliminating the school-taught phrase now current, particularly in Germany, of so-called Caesarism, end quote. Marx. Because, quote, this superficial historical analogy, end quote, forgets that the Roman class struggle took place inside the free minority, over the backs of the passive slave majority. The specific analogy Marx was objecting to in this passage began flourishing in 1866 and has nothing to do with our subject. The term itself had become current about 1851 with one of the journalistic interpretations of Bonapartism. Marx himself had made his own analogies with Caesarism more than once. In the New York Tribune articles, he had referred to the Bonaparte regime as, quote, the Caesarism of Paris, end quote, and to, quote, military despotism, the rule of the Caesars, end quote, in contemporaneous Europe. And when he discussed Bonaparte's decision for war in 1859, he brought out the phrase, quote, au Caesar, au nihil. I don't know what that means. End quote. For ourselves, the main point is not that Caesar was a Bonaparte or Bonaparte a Caesar, but that both exemplified a more inclusive phenomenon, state autonomization resting on a class equilibrium. The day after Bonaparte's coup d'etat, Engels already had in mind the analogy between this event and, quote, the rule of the Praetorians, end quote. He wrote to Marx, quote, it remains to be seen whether the Praetorian regime of the days of the Roman Empire, which presupposed a widely extended state organized throughout on military lines, a depopulated Italy, and the absence of a modern proletariat, is possible in a geographically concentrated, thickly populated country like France with a large industrial proletariat. End quote. Engels. But they found that such broad social differences do not preclude broad analogies when a common pattern is embodied in varying historical forms. End footnote. Where the hell am I? It is a pity that neither Marx nor Engels had occasion to take up the political forms in which the Roman state disintegrated in the course of, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes, end quote. Most of their writings were ad hoc, and this hoc never arose as a pressing theoretical problem. There are many animadversions to the Roman period in their works, but nothing substantial on the politics of the period of social disintegration, the period when the imperial state more and more came forward as the only cement of the system, while no revolutionary class appeared with aspirations toward a new and progressive social transformation. For present purposes, the pattern may briefly be summarized as follows. The state sought to maintain the status quo by patching here and there, substituting its own apparatus as necessary for the failing mechanisms of the old order. But this way of maintaining the status quo became just another channel through which the unviable status quo changed into something else, for it could not remain the same. Since the status quo could not remain quo, though patchwork on the body started turning at long last into the body itself. By the time of Diocletian, around 300 AD, if not before, there could be no doubt about what had happened. The old ruling classes had disintegrated with their old social order. The state's role had changed over centuries from preserving an ongoing social system to replacing the organizer classes of disintegrating civil society with its own cages and mechanisms. Footnote: the best short introduction to this question is by Wallbank. See bibliography, which also has a, quote, note on books. End footnote. One of the few places in which Marx touched on this process, in passing, dealt with another problem altogether. Marx wished to give an example of how the tillers of the land could be expropriated not by driving them off, but by appropriating the product of their labor beyond the point of viability. Quote, in the last days of the Roman Empire, the provincial decurions, which consisted not of peasants but of private landowners, deserted their homes, abandoning their land and even selling themselves into slavery, all in order to get rid of property which had become nothing more than an official pretext for harsh and merciless extortion. End quote. Marx. The merciless extorter in this case was the autonomized state. The victims were part of the former ruling classes. The state that developed has been variously dubbed, quote, state capitalism, quote, state socialism, quote, corporative state, and, quote, fascism by historians, anachronistically resorting to later historical phenomena to find a label for a special type of state arising out of, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes, end quote. For when a whole civil society disintegrates, the only institution remaining to keep society together is the state, not to keep the old society together anymore, but to keep a society, some kind of organized society together on any terms. The autonomized state becomes the residual legatee of society for a historical period. The political institutionalization of force, the state, infuses all the processes of society and subordinates everything to itself. The political and economic institutions fuse. The state is no longer simply a superstructure. The state has swallowed up all of society. This is what Engels saw happening in his own time, but as usual, with a close-up telescopic view. In a summary passage of Great Power, moving in a few lines from the ancient slave societies to, quote, present-day Europe, Engels notes the monstrous growth of state bureaucratization. The state power, quote, grows stronger, however, in proportion as class antagonisms within the state become more acute, and as adjacent states become larger and more populous. We have only to look at our present-day Europe, where class struggle and rivalry and conquest have tuned up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to swallow the whole of society and even the state. End quote. Engels. An unexplained remark like this was possible because Engels assumed everyone knew that a state once had swallowed up, quote, the whole of society, end quote. New section. Section 2, the fusion of politics and economics. When we come to feudalism, there is a marked difference in the formulations of the early Marx, before the German ideology, and the later Marx. An explanation is necessary before the nature of the difference can be appreciated. The new feudal order crystallized in Western Europe out of the, quote, statified society in dissolution. In feudal society, land ownership and power went together. On the manor, the feudal lord was also the embodiment of the state automatically. On the manor, the feudal lord was also the embodiment of the state automatically. Who held the land, held the mastery of society. In this sense, one of the characteristics of feudalism as a social system was its specific way of fusing economic power and political power in the same hands. Especially where feudalism is decentralized, where the power of the nobility has not yet been absorbed by a monarchy or princedom, the power of the ruling class can be, and has been, discussed in two apparently different ways, which are really one. The lord can be considered as the land owner, a socioeconomic category, and his land is his private property. At the same time, the lord is the state power, which is seen to make the land the property of the state. There is no real contradiction. The difficulty, if any, exists solely in our habit of thinking of state power, and economic power necessarily has two separate, if related, powers. That is, our habit of thinking in terms of the social relations of the bourgeois era and social systems in which property ownership does not directly entail political status. Thus, in the third volume of Capital, Marx casually lists, quote, the slave owner, the feudal lord, and the state, for instance, the oriental despot, end quote, as representing different social orders. Obviously, at this point, he is not thinking of the feudal lord as being also the state power, even if only on a duodecimal domain. What the fuck does that mean? A domain is like a land, but like what is duodecimo? A size of book page that results from the folding of each printed sheet into 12 leaves. I have no fucking what. Anyway, obviously at this point, Marx is not thinking of the feudal lord as being also the state power, even if only on a duodecimo domain. But the lord was indeed the state power on the lord's manor. In Western Europe, out of, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes, end quote, of the ancient world, it was the relations of production, established locally between the tiller of the soil and the military-based owner of the land, that gave rise to the specific state forms of the Middle Ages. The political power of the feudal lord was organically fused with his relationship as landowner to the actual producers. If the consequence was that the land was therefore state property, It was an entirely different form of state property than obtained under the Oriental despotism. Also different was the, quote, state production that Marx refers to as existing, quote, in former epochs of Russian history on the basis of serfdom, end quote. This is only another way of saying that, just as quite different social systems exist on the basis of private property as an economic form, so also there are different social systems based on state property as an economic form. As we saw in Part 1, the thinking of the young Marx on social issues was dominated by the Hegelian dichotomy between the particular and the universal, the particularity of private or personal interests versus the universality of public or state interest. The political sphere was the sphere of the universal, the economic sphere was that of the particular, and so the relationship of universal to particular translated into the relationship of political and economic. Footnote: for this see Chapter 3, especially the first few sections, and Chapter 1, Section 1, and Chapter 2, pages 70 to 73. End footnote. For this young Hegelian, an overriding problem was how to fuse the universal interest and the particular into a genuine unity, how to make them identical or reconcile their antagonism through changed political forms and institutions. In this context, it was recognized that such a fusion had existed in the Middle Ages in a specifically feudalistic way. The aim was not to return to those old forms, but to find a way of making the fusion on the basis of modern conditions. This is why the young Marx had occasion so often to refer to the fusion of politics and economics as characteristic of medieval society, to use our terms, not his, As early as 1842, in his Rheinische Zeitung article on the wood theft law, Marx referred to the, quote, mixture of private law and public law such as we meet in all institutions of the Middle Ages, end quote. But it is in his notebook critique of Hegelian politics, written in 1843, that this is done to the greatest extent. One important passage occurs in the section where medieval society was called the, quote, democracy of unfreedom, end quote, discussed in Chapter 3. If the broad and narrow meaning of state in Hegelese are recalled, the following statement becomes clear. Under the old regime, quote, the political sphere was the sole state sphere in the state, the sole sphere in which the content, was the true universal, It stands to reason that the political constitution as such is developed only where the private spheres have attained an independent existence, end quote. It is in modern bourgeoisified society that, quote, the private spheres have attained an independent existence, end quote. That is, independent of the state power, political sphere. Quote, the abstraction of the state as such, belongs only to the modern period because the abstraction of private life belongs only to the modern period. The abstraction of the political state is a modern product, In the Middle Ages, property, trade, society, men were political, Every private sphere had a political character or is a political sphere. Or, in other words, politics was also the character of the private spheres. In the Middle Ages, the political constitution was the constitution of private property, but only because the constitution of private property was the political constitution. In the Middle Ages, the life of the people and the life of the state, political life, were identical, end quote. Marx. Again, in his commentary on Hegel's section 303, Marx, in the course of attacking Hegel's identification of the state bureaucracy as the universal class, also attacks his reactionary way of doing away with the modern split between civil and political life. In Hegel, writes Marx, quote, the civil society's class difference becomes a political difference, end quote. The, quote, separation of, quote, civil and political life end quote, is to be abolished in this way and their, quote, identity established, end quote. Quote, the separation of, quote, civil and political life, end quote, is to be abolished in this way and their, quote, identity established, end quote. Marx. Marx points out that Hegel is trying to re-establish the political medieval state of affairs. Hegel himself admits that, quote, identity, in Hegel's sense, was at its peak in the Middle Ages. Quote, here, bracket, in the Middle Ages, end bracket, the Stände of civil society, bracket, that is, the classes, end bracket, in general, and the Stände in their political meaning, bracket, the estates, end bracket, were identical. The spirit of the Middle Ages can be expressed thusly. The Stände of civil society, bracket, classes, end bracket, and the Stände in their political meaning, bracket, estates, end bracket, were identical because civil society was political society, because the organic principle of civil society was the principle of the state, ... The identity of the civil and political Stände was the expression of the identity of civil and political society. This identity has disappeared, bracket, in modern society, end bracket, end quote. Hegel. Wait, I think that he did say that it was Hegel himself admits that, quote, identity in his sense was at peak in the Middle Ages. I think this quote might be Hegel cited in Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, but it might also just be Marx. So I think it's Hegel. I don't know. There is a good deal more of this. For example, of the medieval Stände, quote, their whole being was political. Their being was the being of the state, end quote. And there's a footnote I missed here that it says, in this passage, the German Stand, plural Stände, is used in two senses in order to distinguish them, as we explained in Chapter 1. The, quote, Stände, in their political meaning, end quote, are the social estates of the medieval order, classes made corporate as a political institution. The, quote, Stände of civil society, end quote, are the socioeconomic classes apart from their formal political status. End footnote. The same point recurs. I don't know if I've said this already. There is a good deal more of this, for example, of the medieval Stände. Quote, their whole being was political. The Stände's being was the being of the state, end quote. The same point recurs in Marx's essay titled On the Jewish Question. These passages have already been quoted in Chapter 5, likewise in the 1844 manuscripts. Quote, in general, the sway of private property begins with landed property. That is its basis. But in feudal landed property, the lord at least appears to be the king of the landed property. ... The piece of real estate is individualized with its lord. It has his rank. It is baronial or ducal along with him. It has his privileges, his jurisdiction, his political position, and so on. ... Hence the proverb, nulle terre sans maître, bracket, no land without a master, end bracket, in which the growing together of the lordship and the landed property is expressed, end quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. As for the tillers of the soil, quote, his, bracket, the Lord's, and bracket, status with respect to them is therefore directly political, end quote. Modern society now requires, quote, that landed property, be drawn completely into the movement of private property and become a commodity, that the rule of the owner appear as the pure rule of private property, of capital, abstracted from all political tincture, Thereby the medieval proverb, nul terre sans mate, is replaced by the modern proverb, l'argent n'a pas de mate, bracket, money has no master, end bracket, which express the complete domination of lifeless matter over people, end quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. Insofar as the state power is constituted directly by the feudal lord without intermediary, the state can hardly be called the executive committee or committee to manage the common affairs of the ruling class. That aphoristic formula requires an obvious readjustment in a society where economic power and political power are fused in the same hands. Insofar as each feudal lord in his own domain, that's how you say that. Let's look at it real quick. Let's see. Demen. Insofar as each feudal lord in his own domain could say, l'état c'est moi, which is the state is me, he had no need of any other formula. It was only as political power was centralized in latter-day feudalism in the hands of a more or less absolute monarchy that the centralized state had to function as the managing committee of the nobility as a class, precisely because land ownership no longer automatically conferred all sovereign political power on the landowner. Next step, insofar as political power is separated from economic control, it first becomes possible for that political power to aspire to or move toward autonomy from the economic masters. This is precisely what happens under the absolute monarchy when the history of state autonomization resumes. But before we can consider this, we must take up a loose end. New section, Section 3, Private Property under Feudalism. We have detailed the thinking of the young Marx on the fusion of politics and economics and feudalism. But what did the mature Marx have to say about this feature of the feudal social order before the era of absolute monarchy? Very little one way or the other, and the above stated view is reaffirmed very glancingly, never directly. The reasons for this appear to be two. 1. From the German ideology on, that is, as soon as Marx develops the historical method which points him towards seeking the roots of modern society in the productive relations of previous history, his attention is overwhelmingly concentrated on the later period of feudalism. The later period of feudalism. It is difficult to find even passing references to the earlier feudal period, just as it was difficult to find references to the long period of Roman society in dissolution. Marx and Engels' interest, usually responsive to some contemporary political task, in the same sense that the writing of Capital was undertaken as a political need, focused on the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and to a lesser extent on the transition from primitive society to various succeeding forms, including Oriental despotism, but they virtually ignored the historical problems of several centuries of European history, from the palmy days of the Roman world to the onset of absolute monarchy, including the transition from, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes, end quote, to Western European feudalism. Footnote: here is an unexploited opportunity for the paranoidal school of Marxology to explain that Marx was, quote, paralyzed by the thought of the Emperor Diocletian, since he never offered a theory of the late imperial state. Actually, the list of what Marx did not discuss is much longer, and therefore offers endless material for non-explanations. End footnote. I don't know who that was a pass at, but it's a pass at somebody. 2. Where Marx and Engels do comment on the social relations of feudalism, their emphasis is always on the thesis that the underlying determinant of the system was the socioeconomic relation between the landowner and the actual producer, serf. The feudal lord is here considered as the owner of private property, as we have already discussed. At no time did Marx or Engels stop to take up the analysis of the nature of the state power under decentralized feudalism. These emphases can be seen most clearly perhaps in the German ideology, because it lies on the border between the young Marx and the mature Marx. In this book, where the method of exploring the material factors in history is first being worked out, Marx's emphasis is that under feudalism, quote, land ownership played the chief role, end quote, and that in the feudal outlook it was land ownership that determined, quote, the whole structure of society, end quote. Marx does not, however, go on to discuss directly what sort of state power was thus determined. Perhaps he thought the question sufficiently covered by his brief statement about the origin of feudalism. Quote, the feudal system, ... had its origin, as far as the bracket German, and bracket conquerors, bracket of Rome, and bracket were concerned, in the martial organization of the army during the actual conquest, and this only evolved after the conquest into the feudal system proper through the action of the productive forces found in the conquered countries, end quote. Marx Engels, German ideology. And elsewhere in the work, quote, the hierarchical structure of land ownership and the armed body of retainers associated with it gave the nobility power over the serfs, end quote. German ideology. The feudal system, wrote Engels much later, was, quote, in its very origin a military organization, end quote. Engels. Army. I'm not sure what that is, what piece that's precisely referring to. The full title of it, I mean. The implications of these statements correct the one-sidedness of the emphasis on land ownership alone, but the implications are not brought out. Instead, Marx hurries on to latter-day feudalism, since it is this that leads to the historical roots of modern society. Further on, there's a section devoted to, quote, the relation of state and law to property, which gives the feudal era short shrift. It gets little more than one phrase in a sentence, which moves rapidly on to modern capital. Characteristically, we learn that it is not until the rise of modern capital that there comes into being, quote, pure private property, which has cast off all semblance of a communal institution and has shut out the state from any influence on the development of property, end quote. It is, furthermore, only in the bourgeois-dominated state that, for the first time, quote, the emancipation of private property from the community, the state has become a separate entity beside and outside civil society, ... end quote. And that, quote, private property has become entirely independent of the community, end quote. If this becomes true under the modern bourgeois state for the first time, then the case must have been otherwise under feudalism. But Marx is not interested in backtracking to cover that problem for its own sake. A similar pattern is found in later writings, insofar as any attention is paid to the question at all. More than once it is implied in passing that under feudalism the relation between the political and the economic was different from today, but this difference is not in the center of the exposition. Thus in Capital, the book, there is the remark that, quote, the leadership of industry is an attribute of capital, just as in feudal times the functions of general and judge were attributes of landed property, end quote. Marx. These later functions of feudal times were state functions. These later functions of feudal times were state functions. Elsewhere, when landed property is bourgeoisified, integrated into capitalist relations, it, quote, receives its purely economic form by discarding all its former political and social trappings and admixtures, end quote. Quote, all those traditional accessories, end quote, of feudal landed property. In a real sense, feudal landed property has to be depoliticized in order to be bourgeoisified. In a real sense, feudal landed property has to be depoliticized in order to be bourgeoisified. In other notes, Marx makes the same point that private property and land becomes exchange value only as, quote, the product of capital and of the complete subordination of the state organism to capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Shit. Where am I? Okay. But before capitalist relations become dominant, the state organism is not only subordinated to capital, it is not subordinated to civil society in general. Under feudal relations, state power is inextricable from landed property. The same goes for Engels. In Engels' draft for the manifesto, he wrote that as distinct from, quote, feudal and guild property, end quote, the rise of capitalism, quote, created a new form of ownership, the rise of capitalism, quote, created a new form of ownership, private ownership, end quote. This reflects a feeling that private ownership did not exist under feudal forms of property, obviously a vague formulation until explained. In the Peasant War in Germany, Engels was not loath to write about the status of feudal vassals as, quote, almost independent sovereigns, end quote, when the bonds of empire fell apart. There is a passage of similar force in Engels' Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. Such is the state of this question in Marx and Engels' writings, very unsatisfactory. Fortunately, a quite different situation exists when we come to the more decisive period that followed, the era of absolute monarchy with respect to the issue of state autonomization. New section, Section 4, Absolute Monarchy and State Autonomy. The fragmentation of state power in the hands of the separate feudal lords, each sovereign in his domain. How do you say that again?
Domain.
I said it right. All right. Domain. Who the hell am I? Lost my spot. The fragmentation of state power in the hands of the separate feudal lords, each sovereign in his domain, had originally arisen as a means of organizing the disintegration of the ancient world, but this political fragmentation could not endure indefinitely in the face of the economic integration promoted by merchant capital, the growth of cities, and the use of money. These pressures necessitated a centralized state power. Without it, even the old feudal nobility could not survive. They exhausted their historical initiative in finding ways to kill themselves off, quote, devoured by the great feudal wars, end quote, or, quote, annihilated in the peasant wars, end quote. In England, they were in a fair way of exterminating themselves in the so-called War of the Roses. This class as a whole had to be deprived of its sovereign political power in order to preserve its socio-economic privileges, or more exactly, to preserve as much as possible of its ruling class privileges. It had to be shorn of political power for its own good, as usual, which means for the good of the social system in which it had a place. As before and after, state autonomization came in as a means of maintaining a system in dissolution by rescuing the system's ruling class from the ruling class's own incapacities. The centralization of state power in the hands of one feudal lord, all others becoming dependent vassals, took the form of the absolute monarchy. This absolutism was the formal reflection of the need for state autonomization. The more absolute, the more autonomous, the more a duke here or a count there retains some of his former power, the less autonomous the centralized state. The feudal lord, as a member of a ruling class, remained a landowner, still exploiting in serf labor and deriving his income therefrom. The land, which was formerly both his private property and his state property, now took on more and more the aspect of feudal private property only, later to merge into bourgeois private property, and at the same time, ownership became more and more divorced from management of the domain. The domain. Quote, the landed noble turned into the court noble, the faster and surer to be ruined, end quote. Footnote. So Engels. In the German ideology, this idea was used to show how Max Stirner's, quote, ego had derived its views on, quote, my self-enjoyment. One section of his book, quote, in the modern times, the philosophy of enjoyment arose with the decline of feudalism and with the transformation of the feudal landed nobility into the jovial, extravagant nobles of the court under the absolute monarchy, end quote. Marx Engels, German Ideology. Parenthesis, an even more telling example is that other, quote, anarchist classic, Rabelais' depiction of the Abbey of Theleme. I don't know. End footnote. In notes for a revision of his Peasant War in Germany, Engels remarked that the absolute monarchy, quote, had to be absolute just because of the centrifugal character of all elements. However, quote, absolute, bracket is, and bracket, not to be understood in the vulgar sense. Where the hell am I? Lost my spot. Where the hell am I? I don't know. I think I lost my spot. In notes for a revision of his Peasant War in Germany, Engels remarked that the absolute monarchy, quote, had to be absolute just because of the centrifugal character of all elements. However, quote, absolute, end quote, bracket is, and bracket, not to be understood in the vulgar sense, bracket it was, and bracket, in constant struggle partly with the estates, partly with the insurgent feudal lords and cities, ... end quote. Engels. And Engels makes the interesting suggestion that the absolute monarchy should rather be called the ständische, or estate, monarchy. That is, it should be designated not by the new political form on top, but by the way in which the underlying population was organized in socio-political estates. This monarchy, Engels adds, was, quote, still feudal in decline, and bourgeois in embryo, end quote. Engels. This state was, quote, still feudal, end quote, inasmuch as it began as the only possible way of saving the feudal lords from shaking their society apart with their blind alley brawls. In notes for a history of Germany, Engels pointed to the confused tangle of feudal rights among numerous reasons for a permanent state of internecine conflict. Quote, how could conflicts be avoided? Hence the century-long alternation of the vassals' attraction to the royal center, which alone could protect them against external foes and against each other, and of their repulsion from that center into which the attraction inevitably and perpetually changed. Hence that continuous struggle between royalty and vassal, whose tedious uproar drowned out everything else during that lengthy period, when robbery was the only source of income worthy of free men. ... End quote. Engels' conclusion, quote, "It is plain that in this general chaos, royal power was the progressive element. It represented order and confusion and the budding nation as opposed to the dismemberment into rebellious vassal states. All the revolutionary elements taking shape under the feudalistic surface gravitated just as much towards royalty as the latter gravitated towards them." End quote. Engels. Centralized monarchic power offered both protection and encouragement to the burgeoning bourgeoisie. Quote, "The alliance of royalty and burghdom dates back to the 10th century, often interrupted by conflicts because nothing pursued its course consistently in the Middle Ages. It was each time more firmly and vigorously renewed, and it helped royalty to its final victory (over the nobility) and royalty, by way of thanks, subjugated and plundered its ally." End quote. Engels. Decay of feudalism in the peasant war in Germany. The basic conception that the absolute monarchy represented a form of relative state autonomy balanced on the countervailing pressures of contending classes already appeared in the German ideology. There it comes up first as codicil to one of the earliest statements of Marx's characteristic theory of the state, that the state is, quote, "the form of organization which the bourgeois necessarily adopt, both for internal and external purposes, for the mutual guarantee of the bourgeoisie's property and interest." End quote. Marx. Quote, "The independence of the state is only found nowadays in those countries where the estates have not completely developed into classes, where the estates done away with in more advanced countries still have a part to play, and where there exists a mixture, countries, that is to say, in which no one section of the population can achieve dominance over the others. This is the case particularly in Germany." End quote. Marx Engels' German ideology. Germany's retarded social development is linked with the fact that none of the social spheres (estates turning into classes) had been capable of asserting exclusive domination. Quote, "The necessary consequence was that during the epoch of absolute monarchy, which was seen here (Germany) in its most stunted and semi-patriarchal form, the particular social sphere which, owing to the division of labor, was responsible for the administration of public interests, acquired an abnormal independence, which was pushed even further in the modern bureaucracy. Thus the state constituted itself as an apparently independent power, and this position, which in other countries was only transitory, a transitional stage, it is maintained in Germany to the present day." End quote. It doesn't say, but I'm assuming that's from the German ideology. There were certain consequences in the ideological superstructure. Quote, "It is this position of the state which explains both the honest character of the government officialdom, which is found nowhere else, and all the illusions about the state which are current in Germany, as well as the apparent independence of German theoreticians in relation to the burghers, the apparent contradiction between the form in which these theoreticians express the interests of the burghers and those interests themselves." End quote. German ideology. The equilibrium thesis put forward directly by Engels in 1847, quote, "The Prussian king, representing the central power of the state, and supported by the numerous class of government officers, civil and military, besides having the army at his disposal, was enabled to keep down the middle classes by the nobility, and the nobility by the middle classes, by flattering now the interest of the one, and then those of the other, and balancing as much as possible the influence of both. This stage of absolute monarchy has been gone through by almost all the civilized countries of Europe, and in those most advanced, it has now given place to the government of the middle classes." End quote. Engels. And then this stage was mentioned in the Communist Manifesto as one of the steps in the development of the bourgeoisie, when it was, quote, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, ... End quote. Communist Manifesto. Footnote. Semi-feudal is the loose translation. In the standard Moores Engels English version of the Ständische monarchy, that is, the monarchy based on estates, the same term that Engels later suggested as a substitute for absolute monarchy. End footnote. Soon afterward, the equilibrium thesis was applied by Engels to countervailing social forces other than classes, namely to the disparate national groups in the Austrian Empire of the Habsburgs, in combination with a class equilibrium. To begin with, the Habsburgs, quote, supported the city burghs against the nobility and the towns against the princes, end quote, as, quote, the sole condition on which a great monarchy was at all possible, end quote. Engels. But the developing bourgeoisie began to threaten the dominance of the nobility, and growing peasant opposition aroused old national struggles. Quote, in this state of affairs, Metternich brought off his masterpiece. With the exception of the most powerful feudal barons, Metternich deprived the rest of the nobility of all influence over the conduct of the state. Metternich deprived the bourgeoisie of its strength by winning over the most powerful finance barons. Indeed, he had to do this under compulsion of the financial situation. Thus supported by the high feudal nobility and high finance as well as the bureaucracy and the army, Metternich attained the ideal of absolute monarchy more completely than any of his rivals. The burghs and peasants of every nationality Metternich kept in hand through the nobles of the same nationality and the peasants of all the other nationalities, the nobles of every nationality, through their fear of the burghs and peasants of their own nationality. The various class interests, narrow-minded nationalist tendencies, and local prejudices, complicated as they were mutually held in check to the fullest, and followed the old scoundrel Metternich the greatest freedom of movement. And allowed the old scoundrel Metternich the greatest freedom of movement. End quote. Engels. There's a footnote here. In a shorter version of this explanation in Engels' later Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, finance barons and high finance become large stock-jobbing capitalists. Finance barons and high finance become large stock-jobbing capitalists. Quote, the government of Prince Metternich turned upon two things. Firstly, to keep every one of the different nations subjected to the Austrian rule, in check by all other nations, similarly conditioned. Secondly, and this always has been the fundamental principle of absolute monarchies, to rely for support upon two classes, the feudal landlords and the large stock-jobbing capitalists, and to balance, at the same time, the influence and power of either of these classes by that of the other, so as to leave full independence of action to the government. End quote. Engels. End footnote. New section. Absolute monarchy, the down phase. There was a common partner to the absolute monarchies, including the Austrian, at first a push behind the rising bourgeoisie in order to keep the nobility in line, then a bridling of the new class to prevent it from taking the bit in its teeth. Thus the era of absolute monarchy had its ascending line, when as, quote, a product of bourgeois development, end quote, the royal power played a progressive role, and then it started downward on the path of decline when it stood in the way of further progress. In the first period, the bourgeoisie was not moved above the nobility, but merely alongside as recipient of the state's favors. Quote, here, bracket, in Kautsky's article, wrote Engels, and bracket, there is missing a lucid exposition of how the absolute monarchy came into existence as a naturally evolved compromise between nobility and bourgeoisie, and how it therefore had to protect certain interests of both sides and distribute favors to them. In this process, the nobility, politically put in retirement, got as its share the plundering of the peasantry and of the state treasury, and indirect political influence through the court, the army, the church, and the higher administrative authorities, while the bourgeoisie received protection through tariffs, monopolies, and a relatively orderly administration of public affairs and justice. End quote. Engels. Letter to Kautsky, 20th of February, 1889. In the later period, the Crown was still trying to keep the bourgeois forces locked into this pattern in spite of their increasing economic power, but this was no longer possible on the basis of the old division of the plunder. The Crown therefore had to shift the direction of its thrust in order to try to maintain the old equilibrium. That is, in order to maintain the status quo, it had to alter the status quo. At this point, the absolute monarchy turned against the current of economic development. Now, quote, as a rule, end quote, such a turn means the ongoing system is no longer historically viable and must eventually succumb. Footnote. Engels and Anti-Düring, quote, after the political force has made itself independent in relation to society and has transformed itself from its servant into its master, it can work in two different directions. Either it works in the sense and in the direction of the natural economic development, in which case no conflict arises between them, the economic development being accelerated, or it works against economic development, in which case, as a rule, but with but few exceptions, force succumbs to it. End quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Bracket, the first part of this passage was discussed in chapter 11, page 248, end bracket. If a rule allows exceptions, as most do, it is still necessary to explain the exceptions in terms of the framework established by the rule. In this case, Engels is able to allow for exceptions because of the concept of state autonomy as a resultant of class forces. End footnote. For the absolute monarchy, too, there was a period. For the absolute monarchy, too, there was, quote, a period when the crown played the burrs against the nobility in order to keep one estate in check by means of the other, but from the moment when the bourgeoisie, still politically powerless, began to grow dangerous owing to its increasing economic power, the crown resumed its alliance with the nobility, and by doing so called forth the bourgeois revolution. End quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. The pattern of decline was discussed by Marx a little more fully in an 1847 article. The target of this article was the feudal socialist tendency in Germany, whose anti-capitalism led it to support the absolutist regime against the bourgeoisie. Marx was therefore intent on emphasizing the reactionary role to which the absolute monarchy had descended. The bourgeoisie, Marx explained, originally helped the monarchy to victory against the great feudal lords, and later exploited the financial needs of the crown to make it dependent on high finance. Now the absolute monarchy was trying to check further progress. Quote, having arisen out of the defeat of the feudal orders and itself taken the most active part in their destruction, it now tries to maintain at least the semblance of feudal distinctions, formerly encouraging commerce and industry, and simultaneously the rise of the bourgeois class, as necessary conditions of both national power and its own resplendence. The absolute monarchy now stands in the way of commerce and industry, which have become more and more dangerous weapons in the hands of an already powerful bourgeoisie. End quote. Marx. True, a process of bourgeoisification takes place inexorably, but the absolute monarchy sets its face against this development. It tries to hold back the clock. Quote, in Prussia, as previously in England and France, the absolute monarchy does not let itself be bourgeoisified amicably. It does not abdicate amicably. Besides their personal prejudices, the princes have their hands tied by a whole civil, military, and clerical bureaucracy, components of the absolute monarchy which by no means want to change their status as rulers for one, as servants, with respect to the bourgeoisie. For another thing, the feudal orders hold back. For them, it is a question of to be or not to be, that is, property or expropriation. It is clear that the absolute monarchy, in spite of all the servile genuflections of the bourgeoisie, perceives its real interest to lie on the side of these feudal orders. End quote. Marx. Thus, when push comes to shove, the absolutist state, quote, perceives the absolutist state's real interest to lie, end quote, on the same side as the decaying aristocracy. It is plainly not acting in this respect as the managing committee of the old aristocracy, now far gone in marasmus and political impotence. It is acting in its own real interests, including the interest of its components, the various sectors of the ruling state bureaucracy, which has the social power to tie the hands of the head of state. New section, section 6. From absolutism to Bonapartism. Given this analysis of the play of class forces producing the absolute monarchy in both its up and down phases, there is a plain relation between this state form and the state form of Bonapartism. Both are autonomized states resting on an equilibrium of contending classes, but the classes in question are different. In the first case, quote, the basic condition of the old absolute monarchy, end quote, was, quote, an equilibrium between the landed aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, end quote, while, quote, the basic condition of modern Bonapartism, end quote, is, quote, an equilibrium between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, end quote. Engels, Housing Question. Quote, in the class struggle between... Is there a footnote that I missed? Wait. There's a footnote that I missed. Let me read that first. Engels' letter was educationally addressed to Edward Bernstein, then in the heyday of his revolutionary period as editor of Der Sozialdemokrat. A few months later, Bernstein had occasion to show what he had learned in an important lead article. In this article, the pertinent passage is interesting because of its degree of generalization. Quote, state absolutism, end quote, wrote Bernstein, quote, is the political expression of quite definite social conditions. It is found everywhere where a class that has been the ruling class up to then feels itself in decline, while the new class that is developing is not yet strong enough to rule. Hence we find it everywhere at the close of the Middle Ages, in England, in France, in Germany, end quote. Bernstein. Engels thought the article, quote, very good, but his comment makes no specific reference to this passage. End footnote. Oh shit, no, that wasn't a footnote I missed. I haven't gotten to it yet. Quote, in the class struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie, parenthesis, wrote Engels in a letter, in parenthesis, that's where the footnote is too. The Bonapartist monarchy, ... played a similar part to that of the old absolute monarchy in the struggle between feudalism and the bourgeoisie, end quote. Engels, letter to Bernstein, 27th of August, 1883. The, quote, Bonapartist monarchy, here is the Prussian under Bismarck. In Prussia, the relationship between absolute monarchy and Bonapartism had a special feature, for the general social backwardness of German conditions caused one to merge into the other. Quote, the basic precondition for the bracket Prussian and bracket monarchy, which had been slowly rotting since 1840, was the struggle between the nobility and bourgeoisie, in which the monarchy held the balance. When the nobility no longer needed protection against the onrush of the bourgeoisie, and it became necessary to protect all the propertied classes against the onrush of the working class, the old absolute monarchy had to go over completely to the form of state expressly devised for this purpose, the Bonapartist monarchy. The Bonapartist monarchy. End quote. Engels, Preface to the Peasant War in Germany, 1874. Evidently, the nobility no longer needed protection against the bourgeoisie after the ignominious collapse of bourgeois radicalism in 1848 to 1849. At the same time, an impetus was given to the bourgeoisification of the bureaucracy itself, as well as of the rural nobility. Footnote. Engels' housing question. In this connection, see Engels' Prussian Schnapps, which is a spirited note on the bourgeoisification of Junkerdom. End footnote. At the same time, an impetus was given to the bourgeoisification of the bureaucracy itself, as well as of the rural nobility. Catching up with itself, Prussia ran the two state forms together in the Bismarckian monarchy, the result being a, quote, pseudo-constitutionalism, end quote, which is, quote, at once the present-day form of the dissolution of the old absolute monarchy and the form of existence of the Bonapartist monarchy, end quote. Engels. Housing question. If the absolutist monarchy could telescope into the Bismarckian, parenthesis, Bonapartist, end parenthesis, state without any break in continuity, it was because of the continuity of the common feature, the autonomization of the state. What changed was the equilibrium pattern of the contending classes on which the state rested. The social formation that assured the continuity of the state through the changeover in class basis. The social formation that assured the continuity of the state through the changeover in class basis must have been, then, the one that Marx pointed to as a decisive component of the autonomized state, the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy. To this question we now turn, last but not least. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.